Okay, good evening. This is Keisha Rogers, and I want to welcome you to the LaRouche PAC Strategic Discussion and Update with Michael Stager. We're going to be talking tonight about the fact that, as many of you know, we are now only 99 days, less than 100 days to the midterm elections. And the question as to what is going to be the defining turning point in these elections, given the fact that everybody knows we have a president who is completely senile in the White House, that the Democrats have gone completely insane, but at the same time, we can't just count on the fact that the Democrats are bad. We also have to recognize that people want something to vote for. They need solutions. And the Republicans, in terms of those who are running the establishment right now, have to understand, and it has to be made clear, that the American people are not going to sit by idly while the economy is collapsing, their lives are being destroyed. And President Trump has made this clear. His commitment is to the American people. His commitment is to defining what is required to make America great again. And at the center of that fight, as we go into decisive midterm elections, tomorrow, as people know, we have the August 2nd elections, and going into these midterms. This includes Arizona, Michigan, Missouri, Kansas, and Washington. And a lot of these places, LaRouche PAC is very active. We're working actively with candidates who have taken up the platform of LaRouche PAC, putting forth what is needed to restore the true American system of political economy, an American economic revolution. Because it's interesting, I was reading today and talking with some colleagues earlier, the fact that there was a report that was put out and an interview that was done, I guess it was by Charlie Kirk, who people remember, he is the head of Turning Point, working with a lot of young people. And one thing that was made very clear and important, and something that Michael and I have been discussing on these calls that we have been putting forth, as I just said, that this idea that some people in the establishment and Republicans are putting forth, that we are dealing with a rejection election. And it's enough to just have a rejection election, to go out there and reject the Democrats, is not working. That people want something to vote for a sound economic policy, for solutions. Now, that gets us to the point of what we just saw over this recent period with the ramming through and what President Trump called the playing of some of the establishment Republicans who went along with and probably were in cahoots with these Democrats when it came to the bills that were just passed. And I'm sure people are going to ask about that. Michael can get into it a little bit on the so-called Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS bill. Now, I just will give everyone a heads up. We're still working out the details. We're going to do a special report and special meeting on this coming Saturday. Our colleague Brian Lance is in the midst of writing a report in a paper on the implications of these bills, which have made headlines all over the place. And I invite people, if you're listening to this discussion on YouTube, in order to get the notices for these discussions. We only record and are taking the opening remarks of this discussion. And so if you want to get involved in upcoming discussions or to participate in our live discussions, you need to register, and you can find that registration link below in the description of the YouTube channel, and that will be posted here as well. So I just want to remind people of that. You need to go to LaRouchePAC.com, register for these classes. But as I was just saying, there is a special report we're going to be doing. But one of the things of note from this is, as everybody knows, one of the biggest threats coming from the Biden administration has been this Build Back Better, this Build Back Broke phony agenda, but particularly they have been hard set on pushing this green climate agenda. This is something that President Trump has not let up on in terms of exposing the fraud, the criminality of this green agenda. Well, I just wanted to make it clear, as Brian is going to be reporting on Saturday and also is writing up a report, extensive report on, in terms of the implications of these two bills, were the fact that they were already set in place to do exactly that, to push again this whole Green New Deal operation. And so when you hear people like, as has been reported, such as Cornyn, which we know is John Cornyn, the senator in Texas here, is a joke. One of the things that Cornyn has tried to say was that this bill that they had gotten hoodwinked, basically, that they were told, the Republicans who voted for the CHIPS bill were told that if they voted for the CHIPS bill and pushed this, then the Manchin and Schumer bill would not have ever taken place. So there's all kinds of fraud going on right now. But the reality is, what we're going to get at is what we see coming from the establishment Republicans, as well as those toeing the line of the Democrats and backing the senile president in the White House, is not addressing the reality of the crisis. And this is what we need to get at, as we are very short on time here. And it's a question not just of who's going to be put forth in the 2024 election. As we will discuss here, there's no other person qualified for president except for President Donald Trump. He has to take the lead. But at the same time, we have to actually set the stage for that to happen. And this is where you, the American people, come in crucially. You cannot just sit back idly and say, we'll see what's going to happen here. We need to make sure that each and every one of you on this call is ready for a fight, because we're in the middle of a war in terms of the fact that this economic crisis is hitting like nobody's ever seen. And the fact that you got establishment Republicans and Democrats playing games with the American people cannot be stood for any longer. This gets to the question of why it is, as one of the headlines shows, midterms looming, Dems remain focused on January 6th hearing instead of inflation and border. That's just one example right now. You have reports showing that Republicans that Democrats, particularly in Pennsylvania, there was a report 38,000 Democrats are transferring to Republicans. So there's a lot going on here, but at the same time, the question is, who has the solutions to put forth the needed building out of this economic crisis, and to ensure that in these midterm elections, we are putting true America first, true MAGA candidates in there. President Trump just did 2 major interviews, and this is what he talked about. American people have to hold on, that we are going to make America great again. But that's not just something to cross your fingers and hope and pray for. We have to be at the center of the fight to make that happen. So with that, I want Michael to come in here and make some comments or thoughts on what is going on, and maybe comment on some of the things I opened with here.
Great, thanks, Keisha. Yeah, good introduction. Welcome, everyone. It's August 1st. We're into August now. Tomorrow is a big primary. We've had a number of candidates on from some of these states: Washington, Arizona, Missouri, Michigan. Those all 4 tomorrow, probably a couple more. If any candidates are on tonight, please jump in. We're honored to have you on right before the primary. More than likely, you're out campaigning. So this is somewhat a big primary. Trump is doing a call right now for a gubernatorial candidate in Michigan. He's endorsed heavily in Arizona, and there's a strong contest for the GOP primary for Senate in Missouri. So we'll see how that unfolds. But there's a big factor of Well, let me just step back immediately just from the primaries and Trump. Keisha touched on those, but I think the battlefield historically is a little bit larger today than many people want to consider. And if you look at it in a sober way, I think it's hard to say that were it not for defensive moves by Russia, by China, and to some extent, just the advent of the danger of nuclear war, that under any other period of history, given the cultural destruction of the United States over the last 50 years, and the reckless abandon of aggressive illegal warfare for the last 20 years, notably in Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Ukraine, and also in Afghanistan to a large degree. I mean, Afghanistan, we won the war there in 2 months. That we would today be the criminal aggressor in a world war. We may even have been had Trump not won in 2016. And that war is what you see unfolding in Ukraine today. It's much more limited than they probably had intended. They probably would have expected to have under the Obama program an al-Qaeda-like control of all of North Africa and much of the Middle East, including Iraq, Syria. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, whatever acronym you give them, it would have been terrorist networks that we were basically supporting, the Muslim Brotherhood that was brought to power in Egypt. That would have flourished all throughout North Africa and throughout the Middle East, into the Caucasus of Russia. And then you had Ukraine. You would have had activity on the western side of China. There was huge problems in the Philippines. That could have spread throughout Southeast Asia. That was the agenda and program under Obama. And so it would be hard to imagine that had we not intervened, LaRouche PAC, especially on Obama, and then ultimately with Trump's campaign and success and his stillness, his strength in opposing aggressive conflicts and largely rewinding them. Like he said, he often tells the story of ISIS and eliminating them at his recent rallies. We would be the criminal aggressor in a major war. And that's not the American people, but that's the degeneracy and criminal nature of the current regime. And as many of us, or all of us on this call know, it dominates both parties to a large extent, not only in Washington, D.C., but in many of the state establishments. And what we have now is a kind of fight in those establishments from the American people that is of historic proportion. There's talk of a possible escalation of the Ukraine war. Now, as of now, I think we mentioned it last Monday, there are reports out of Russia that the HIMARS, these are these multi-launch rocket systems, highly maneuverable rocket launch systems, they have some impact, they have an effect. This is modern warfare. But to a large extent, Russia and Russia's allies in that region, which include these republics, other mercenaries, other organized forces, I don't really know everything on the ground, but they have large control of the territory, and to such an extent that Russian troops are basically recuperating for what is probably going to be an autumnal advance, to basically secure all of the Black Sea coast and most of eastern Ukraine. But there's talk of expanding the conflict into a place like the Balkans, in Serbia and Kosovo, an area that has been an ongoing conflict, which really one of the first places that conflict broke out. The Bosnian War in the early 90s, and the Serbian conflict, the breakaway of Kosovo in the late 90s. And has been a center for conflict and war for hundreds of years. There's also a kind of meddling in China by Pelosi, who's doing a tour with a bunch of her, I guess, it's her 7 dwarfs, gallanting through Asia, threatening to stop to Taiwan. Now, for whatever reason, and I can't state that I know all the background, they see Pelosi as the number 3rd top official, so she's not just a parliamentarian, as other countries might see our government, just a member of Congress or something. She's considered 3rd in line to be the executive of the country, even though that's not really how our system works. We kind of assume it, we kind of think it does as a chain of circumstance, but it's not. It's not how we would go about constituting a government, is just throw the speaker per se in, but it could happen. Nonetheless, the Chinese are irate over this, and it's partly because of it's probably for numerous reasons. Some have to do with the domestic circumstances in China, the COVID lockdowns, real estate issues, other economic problems. It also has to do with just the degeneracy and the weakness of this regime, and the overall concern of war that all nations right now have, that it's undeniable that the state of warfare, that the threat of warfare, that the threat of escalations are now ongoing in multiple locations. And this is how, when we oftentimes reference the British Empire, British intelligence, it's from this standpoint that British intelligence deploy. It's clear that they would have in their sights the Kosovo-Serbia situation. Much like they know the differences in the tribes in northern Iraq and Syria. They know the differences in Kosovo and Serbia. They know how to inflame them. The same is true within Taiwan or Southeast Asia, or in Korea. And they will inflame and manipulate to whatever extent they can to create a kind of instability. This is what a prelude to major global conflict looks like. To think otherwise would be naive. But that doesn't mean you go around screaming nuclear war, with the idea that that will create the conditions or the quality of thinking that will solve the problem. Again, why we often reference that the process in the United States is the most important. Some people, and these are analysts that are oftentimes reading the old note cards from even the last century or earlier, of geopolitics, that this is some kind of British great game and it's a fight over Central Asia. To a large extent, this is not about how Eastern Europe is the gateway into Eurasia, and Eurasia is the center of Eurasia, is the, if you control that, this is this Alfred Mackinder British geopolitics perspective. To a large extent, Russia has just been seen as a threat. And whether it was Napoleon's invasion or the Nazis' invasion, or even really the communism, which created the conditions for the German Nazi invasion. In each case, Russia was adapting to British liberal control on the European continent. Much of the so-called Enlightenment of Voltaire or Rousseau that became the basis of some Russian reforms in the 18th century. Culturally, like a liberalization of Russia. There was a clear, decisive point in Russian politics where they realized they could not adapt, that it didn't matter how much they became more and more like Europe, they posed a threat of consequence to imperial control. That happened with Napoleon. Look, communism didn't arise in Russia. I mean, in some case, communism as an outlook of Leninism in some ways was Russian, but it wasn't. I mean, to a large extent, it was created out of British intelligence networks in Europe, out of this socialist milieu, out of this cultural Marxism that was then brought into and then became dominant in Russia with the Soviet Union. But again, the underlying premise of communism was British liberal philosophy. You'll find all of Marx's cultural outlook stem from British liberalism. And the reason I'm stating this is that it's not a geopolitical question of land area. In some ways, that's an obnoxious concept. It's much more about the cultural reflex Russia has consistently had towards its own national sovereignty and to its own right to exist as a people and as a nation state. It's as old as any nation state in Europe, as old as France, as old as England, to some extent, in terms of its cultural heritage. And it has been unwilling to fully abide by or be under the control, except during really the communist and Soviet Union period, where it was fully under control, basically, of a British intelligence operation. Putin and some of the Russian leadership, I think, to some extent, know this. Lyndon LaRouche briefed many of them personally, some of them that are in the cabinet today. But the point I'm making is that it's that political reflex which is such a threat to an empire. And from the standpoint of real geopolitics, or really we're talking cultural politics or strategic politics, is the question of inability of a people to understand its own role to sovereignty in ways which are distinct towards an imperial and kind of liberal or cultural degeneracy of empire. And that has been long in the waiting in the United States. We have tolerated this kind of new left countercultural takeover of the 1960s incessantly, probably since Watergate, which itself was run by the CIA. It was not run by Washington Post journalists. They were as pathetic then and corrupt then as they are today. They just maintained a better facade, you might say. And so for too long, the American people were not engaged in the quality of fight. Today, when the failure of this regime has become so bad that even a child, Trump tells this story of asking some 4 or 5-year-old child, I can't think of the question off the top of my head, but he asked this question of this child, and he's like, even the child knows. If you asked a child, like, is there a difference between men and women, right? They would say yes. The problem has become so obnoxiously insane. The insanity of this regime, of this cultural outlook, has become so obnoxiously insane that even a young child recognizes that these people are fools. And from that, because it's gotten so far and they still don't have control of the American people. They didn't have control over them in 2016, a decisive moment. And that's why Trump remains so important, because he was the one who intervened then. Everybody else wants to say we can have Trumpism without Trump. You're a British liar. You're a British liberal liar. And I say that with specific intent because part of British liberalism was to say, we don't want to deal with the individual, we'll just take the systems of thought. We don't need individual discoverers. We don't need great political leaders. We just take systems of thought. And we can get rid of, basically mean like textbook education. What is textbook education? It means taking a system of thought and ignoring anybody that created the discoveries in it, whether it's a mathematics textbook or a physics, whatever. You just show the results. Was the discovery, the challenge, the ironies, the problems, the historical context. It's like a musical piece. You don't know about the history or the profound nature of the fight or the mind of the composer. Just play the notes. And so they've done this, and they think this way. And they try to impose that on people. And they try to say, if you recognize the greatness of an individual, you're a cult, you're authoritarian. But you have to have great individuals. It's the very premise. It's what the candidates that have put themselves out to run for office recognize that. You that take the time to get on these calls have some sense of that. And you wonder why more people don't. But it's a question of challenging them that it's possible, but it's voluntary. I mean, you might hear the voice of God telling you you have to do it, but in a certain sense, it's still voluntary. No one's compelling you. And that there's that taking that responsibility. Now, I say all of this because underlying this threat of war, and to a large extent, even since the time of Napoleon and the French Revolution, this has been true. Really, the response, the globalist oligarchical response to the American Revolution, to the American constitutional formation, to a united nation dedicated to physical progress and development. That since that concept, they have worked desperately to now control the means of that political and economic success. And they did that with specific intent around the idea of economics. And I'm going to take this up in a specific way because I think it's perhaps one of the most important questions that anyone political today can help introduce into the political discussion of our country. And it is a very viable revolutionary change in the incoming Trump administration regarding how they define the success of their policies and justify the basis by why they're following these policies to make it a coherent understanding. That was lacking. It's lacking largely because the academics who try to capture that system are incompetent today. We need a whole new level of people that are actual competent scientific thinkers. We don't need mechanists. We don't need people that believe in mere systems of thought. We need people that recognize human thought, human activity is the actual measure of the universe. You can't take human thought out and expect to measure the universe. That would be absurd. And yet that's what's done today. Even in economics, that's what's done. You're measuring human society and you take out human thought. We've become that reductionary. And so to give you an example of what I mean, and this is really the heart of it, to say, look, I think we can shift this. The Trump administration will adopt new economic standards because they can't continue to abide by the ones that are being currently used. Now, Keisha referenced these two bills, and Brian Lance will have something up on our website over the coming week, I think, and perhaps something short up soon. And a discussion earlier today, and Brian follows these numbers and the evaluations closely, but you have an administration today denying there's a recession. We're seeing contraction of basically GDP. Now, that means that economic transactions are slowing down. But they say, but employment is rising. But when you look at the actual employment numbers, actual people in the labor force is shrinking. So how is employment going up when labor force, people in the labor force, that number of people in the labor force is decreasing? How can employment be increasing? Because for every person that takes a second job, that's another person employed. Now, many, if not all of you on the call will be well aware that statistics is a good, easy way to lie. It's not difficult to basically move numbers around or pick out a statistical number and say this is the new metric. But the main metric we use, well, there's really two, is GDP in the stock market. And the stock market is a sense of the confidence in the amount of transactions that people are going to make in the future. They're going to buy more of this product. They're going to engage more in airline flights. They're going to engage more in travel. They're going to engage more in purchases. And this is going to increase imports and exports, and it's going to increase purchasing, and it's going to increase all of these things. And so people bet on the market with the idea, this is ostensible, of course. It's largely run by algorithmic supercomputers now, and it's all a racket. But the ostensible idea underlying it is that the stock market measures confidence in people's ability to expand their transactions, that the GDP will continue to grow. Well, how do we measure? So we measure the economy by GDP. And then people look to the stock market, and if it's going up, and then you get everybody to put all their retirements in the stock market, and they think of the stock market as their own bank account, it becomes worse than reductionary. But the GDP, what is the GDP? It's transactions in an economy. How do we measure those transactions? By the dollar amount. So if we produce corn, oranges and potatoes and beef and hogs and chickens and so on, pork bellies, all of that's measured in financial dollars. And the more transactions we have, essentially the more GDP we have. And the more transactions mean there's growth in the economy. Now, in some sense, it seems fair. It's the basic premise of British liberal economics, people like Adam Smith, that you have desires, you want to feed those desires. If you can go and feed your own desires, you will go and create more economic transactions. And if the abundance of people are able to meet their own desires and they're increasing their amount of transactions, then the economy will essentially grow by people then producing more goods or services to meet those desires. So the law of so-called supply and demand. But I think, you get a sense of how measurements or a metric like GDP works. Once we say it's transactions and it's the dollar amount of those transactions, say per capita, then there are clearly things we could do. Just like there are things they do on the stock market, like stock buybacks, where a company will borrow money to go buy its own stock and put the company in more debt, but raise its share price to make it look like there's confidence in the company's ability to participate, to sell more things, or engage in more transactions. And you can do the same thing with GDP. Well, you give everybody a credit card, get everybody to go out there and buy restaurant food instead of cooking at home. More transactions, more GDP activity. How about we say inflation's good? There was a time, even in my life, where I knew inflation was a bad thing, and the people of our society viewed, and economists viewed, inflation as a bad thing. You wanted to keep inflation under control. And ultimately, you really want some form of deflationary pressure on key goods. But today we want more inflation. Well, what happens if you actually start to foster inflation? If you start to print and create inflation? Well, then the dollar amounts of goods and commodities goes up. What happens to GDP? It goes up. So if your home prices are starting to skyrocket and you're having huge transactions of homes, like during the housing bubble, before in 2008 or recently, your GDP goes up. Has that been an effective metric of our economy? And at core, as I said, this question of transactions is one of a British liberal outlook that ultimately the human individual is not engaged in a civilizational challenge. The human individual is simply an animal looking to satiate its own desires. And if you operate that way and then begin to artificially concoct or artificially deploy resources to manipulate that metric, to make sure that metric look good, that the GDP looks good, that the stock market looks good, you will increasingly throw a nation into economic crisis. And if you do that throughout a process, you will intrinsically create the growing threats of conflict and war. If anything, not because of the population clamoring for war, but because of a regime who has adopted this British liberal view, whether it's Marxist or Keynesian or Milton Friedman and libertarian, that in essence, when you measure things that way and the regime will begin to fail, it creates the threat of war from that regime to hold on to power. But there's obviously a deeper underlying question here, because this is still a facade, that though they've defined the individual as a beast, there's a deeper political premise there. And the deeper political premise is that if you're just an animal looking for pleasure, you're ultimately unnecessary if there's a growing crisis. And that if the crisis becomes acute, we actually need to lessen the amount of interests or desires. We want less people. We want less consumption for more people and to get them out of the way. That the system is becoming unstable and the population has to be dealt with in some fashion. And they built up mythologies and entire religions on this question, which is what climate change has become in the modern period. A modern religion, a cult mythology that justifies the need at some point to actually have to reduce population. That's what you see implemented by this regime at this crisis point. And certainly a war or a global conflict ultimately can help address that concern. But it's been our tolerance as a people over the course of the century or longer on this question of how do we measure true economic success. In the 19th century, we understood it differently. But as the society becomes more complicated, as we become an advanced industrial and scientific economy, they began to use more liberal, complicated mathematical tools to basically brainwash those who adopted this outlook. And for the rest of the population, life was ultimately not bad. Infant mortality rates are low and so on. Life expectancy has been growing up until the last few years. So they could continue to basically feed off of past production, past growth. This is what Lyndon LaRouche saw in the 1950s and 60s, that we were basically becoming a parasitical economy. We were living off past production. We were living off past infrastructure. And we had set up metrics of economic success that were intrinsically manipulatable. You could just outright manipulate the numbers, print the money, create financial deregulation, and then have tons of financial transactions. And guess what? More GDP. Unleash huge financial bubbles, and they'll create GDP. And so he recognized we needed an entirely new metric of economics. And that would be the only way to begin to address or to establish a viable long-term nation within our country, and ultimately a successful metric for other nations. Now, he came up with two parameters. I'm only going to touch on one of them tonight. Well, I could ultimately touch on both, but it's because of questions of time and maybe it comes up in questions. I'm going to address one specifically because it gets at the heart of at least beginning an approximation in your mind and in the political discourse of our country regarding the kinds of change in the way we measure our success that actually approximates a successful civilization itself. That you could say that civilization is somehow it may run into problems, because by no means are we going to end up perfect. But regardless of the problems we confront, if we continue to adopt that metric as a point of success, or as a marker, at least one reading, one indicator of success, then we will continue to have the means by which we advance. That we can solve other problems because we haven't gotten caught up measuring success when ultimately we've been headed in the direction of total and supreme failure for decades, which is what we've been doing. Think of it. For 50 years, we've been barreling towards total systemic failure. And we're going to hand our children and grandchildren. If this awakening of the American people had not been occurring, we would be threatening to hand our grandchildren and great-grandchildren a complete collapse of our civilization. In many expressions, for certain parts of the population, we have done that. But it's not been perhaps so overwhelming to prevent a solution. But we want to make sure that this never happens again. And the metric Lyndon LaRouche came up with, and you may be familiar with this, we've covered it in some of our classes, but it was the idea of energy flux density. It's actually a very easy concept. And it really has two kinds of considerations. But it basically means how much energy, say kilowatt hour, megawatt hour of power, of electricity, can you produce per square kilometer or per square mile and per capita? And if that's growing, both for the amount of people you have, which means as your population grows, you're producing more kilowatts per person, even though you have more people. And you're actually increasing the means. You're building more power plants, but that's probably going to be quantity, right? Kilowatt hour per capita is if you're having to build more plants in some ways, but to do it per mile or per land area means you also have to be able to figure out how to produce more megawatts per plant, that you're advancing the quality of your energy supply. And so we get into two questions. One is you're producing more and more energy, electricity, an abundance of it per capita. So if we have 330 million today, if we have 400 million by 2050, we would have increased our per capita production by more than 20%. So if we have, I don't even know how many gigawatts we produce in the country right now. We have 100 nuclear power plants. They're probably about a gigawatt each, a little less. In terms of that proportion on nuclear, we would increase our nuclear power supply by more than 20 plants, by 25 or 30 plants. And you'd probably want to do more nuclear. Now, why? Because it's per land area. So if you do it per land area, how many gigawatts do you get out of a nuclear power plant versus a solar panel? Well, for the land area required, even for the security buffer around a nuclear power plant, it will outsupply on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, average hourly basis, it will outperform any other source of power supply, fossil fuel, wind, or solar. And then wind and solar, it just destroys them. Coal becomes competitive and so on. But the point is that you're having to advance that. You have to make new discoveries. You can't continue to rely upon the same sources of fuel. But you, at the same time, have to constantly increase the amount of fuel per person. Okay, I think I've covered it enough to have everyone have an approximation in your mind. That's energy flux density, or EFD. If that were the metric of economic success, we would be living in a fundamentally different society and civilization. And if that was the metric that was applied to the nations of Africa, South America, and Asia, instead of this green doctrine of population destruction, you would have a flourishing, growing global economy today. Now, there's an additional metric that incorporates other infrastructure questions, other aspects. And these were, and we can get into that later, but it's a similar approximation. So it really, the EFD stands as kind of the leading indicator, you might say. And like I said, it's not comprehensive, but it's this question, which is of a philosophical and scientific question of what we are as a human species, because implied in that metric is not that we're beasts looking for a little pleasure, and we want to feed that, or we want to address our pains with medications and so on to lessen our pains and increase our pleasures. But it looks at human society as something that it's advancing as part of a broad, almost geological force. It's operating upon the land area. It's operating like when we first built and colonized this continent, we used water wheels for largely our industrial processes. But we've learned to develop artificial water wheels and build them wherever we want to on a massive industrial and scale of intensity. And that's the nature of mankind, to create artificial conditions that actually improve the condition of mankind in our production. But there's also that question of advancing that source of power supply, that we make new discoveries about the way the universe works. Certainly the atom was something inconceivable in the 19th century to a large degree, in the way that it developed, in the way that Einstein and Planck and others developed this characteristic of quantum phenomena and the ability to manipulate atoms effectively. And so there's a quality of discovery in mankind. And so in a metric, you have underlying conceptions which are of the most profound religious and philosophical nature. This is the kind of transformation we can make. And it's this kind of change, this kind of conceptual, which is actually a concept that can be taught to every third grade in our country. Every third grader in our country could understand that's the way we measure on a basic level our success as a civilization, as a nation, as an economy. And then that could develop over time. This is the means by which we end this era of perpetual threats of conflict. And it's why the United States today is at the very center of global strategic politics. This rising up of the American people, combined with the kind of breakthroughs in thought around these questions that LaRouche and our movement have made, make this combination a deadly threat to this globalist imperial system. And that really is the basis of how we shut down this war, and we make this revolutionary process, this third American Revolution, remarkably successful. So that was a little bit more extensive tonight, but I hope people found it useful. And so Keisha, I guess I'll hand it back to you if you're there, and we'll see what people think about that.